Okay, so with the release of Cerbos Synapse recently, it now opens up a whole different plethora of systems that you can start building fine-grained, externalized authorization around. And one of those common platforms we see in the data space is Apache Trino, this distributed query engine. And in the typical setup, you have your users, they're executing queries against your Trino infrastructure, and behind that, there's a number of data lakes, databases, typical data stores, those kind of things, and it knows how to go and basically fan out the query. Now, Trino is an example of a system that has a built-in authorization capability, and it has a built-in native OPA plugin, for example. And for a lot of our users, being able to have this unified authorization story with Cerbos as that common layer means we need to be able to plug in and work and orchestrate our policies into systems that support other hooks, for example, an OPA compatible endpoint. So how this works is in Trino, there's three different types of things you can authorize. You can determine whether a user has access to a data set or a table. You can do a row filtering. So if they do have access to a table, how can you limit or restrict which records are returned? And then finally, there's a column masking endpoint. So if they are allowed to return records, but based on their user profile, go and mask and filter those different things. So what you can now do with Cerbos Synapse is you can now expose a request pipeline and a set of extensions that plug into those existing Trino endpoints. So with Cerbos in place, with Synapse set up, you can have extensions for row access. So using policy, a Cerbos policy to determine whether a user can query the data set. Row filtering, so given a set of rows, what rows can be returned. And then the masking use case, using policy and particularly policy outputs to return fragments of SQL to mask or mask out those. And then as it's Cerbos underneath, you can use Cerbos Hub to manage the audit logs and the policy deployment updates. So what this looks like in a real world scenario is we can build, UIs and workflows. So for example, I have a user in the marketing team, they can go and query tables, and I can run a query. And this is actually now going and hitting a Trino instance that's connected to an underlying data set. And we can see we get these particular records from a user. If I'm an analyst, we run the query. I'm going to get a different set of filters. And if I'm an admin, I'm going to get all the data unmasked. Now behind this, we're using those three different hooks, access, row filtering, and column masking to actually use policy to drive what these result sets are based on policy. So Cerbos world, what that means is we can actually define policies. So for example, only allow a viewer to select the users. So we can actually build policy to determine, okay, if you have the viewer role based on your identity, and those attributes could be coming from Trino or an external data source that Synapse pulls data from. We can determine you're only allowed to access this particular schema and this particular table name. When it comes to row filtering, we can determine which filter, and we can actually use policy outputs to return a fragment of standard SQL that gets injected into the SQL query by Trino to filter down and reduce the set as well. And then when it comes to the column masking use case, we can build policy that says, okay, if you're a viewer and Trino is asking what column mask needs to be applied, we're saying if the column name is email, then this is the fragment of SQL that needs to be applied to do the column masking. And you can actually return free form outputs here to apply that to the actual query. So as I've been taking through and running things, we've actually running all these checks through Cerbos instances. This user actually can't hit the transaction table, whilst this user can, but it's a subset. We're applying a row filter based on policy analytics. Coming over to Cerbos Hub, we can see all those decision logs actually running through and being evaluated against that policy in real time. And to show you kind of an example of what this looks like, here's the analyst. It ran a query against the transaction table, and the result is it's an allow, but the row filter needs to be applied as the department column needs to have must be equal to analytics for that access to be allowed. Equally, inside of this environment, when we have things like column masks, we can actually return those outputs as well. So we're using the same Cerbos policy that might be controlling the application layer, the network layer, the data set layer, the API gateway layer, now pushing that policy and driving it down into the actual data platform as well. Very quick one through. Love to chat more about your particular use cases and how you can do row level and column masking level authorization using the same Cerbos policies that are authorizing every other layer of your stack.